The silence after the explosion was deafening. One moment, Lieutenant Sarah Phoenix Martinez was coordinating with her team through her headset, watching the Afghan mountains roll beneath their Black Hawk helicopter. The next moment, she was hanging upside down in her harness, blood dripping from her forehead, staring at the twisted metal that used to be her ride home. But Sarah Martinez wasn't just any soldier. She was one of only 12 women to ever complete Navy SEAL training, a warrior forged in the crucible of America's most elite fighting force. What happened next would test every skill, every ounce of mental toughness, and every survival instinct she had ever learned. This is the story of how a rocket-propelled grenade turned a routine extraction mission into a 7-day nightmare behind enemy lines. It's about what happens when training meets reality, when hope battles despair, and when one person's will to live becomes stronger than an entire enemy's will to kill. Some stories are about heroes. This story is about what it really takes to become one. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Sarah Martinez checked her gear one final time. The Black Hawk helicopter's rotors were already spinning, creating a whirlwind of dust and small rocks around the landing zone. This was supposed to be a simple extraction mission, the kind she had done dozens of times before. Extract a high-value intelligence asset from a remote village, get out clean, and be back at base in time for dinner. Sarah had earned her place among the Navy SEALs through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to stay calm under pressure. At 28 years old, she had already completed 3 combat deployments, survived Hell Week twice due to an injury that forced her to repeat the training, and earned the respect of her male counterparts through actions rather than words. Her teammates called her Phoenix, not because of her red hair, but because of her ability to rise from impossible situations. The intelligence briefing had been straightforward. Their asset, a local tribal leader who had been providing information about Taliban movements, needed immediate extraction. His cover had been blown, and enemy forces were converging on his location. The mission window was narrow, just enough time to get in, grab him, and get out before the area became too hot to handle. Sarah climbed into the Black Hawk alongside her 5-man team. Staff Sergeant Mike "Tank" Johnson sat across from her, methodically checking his rifle for the 3rd time. Next to him was Petty Officer First Class David Ghost, their communications specialist, already testing the radio equipment. Petty Officer Second Class Rico was studying satellite images on his tablet, memorizing every detail of the terrain they would be flying over. Hospital Corpsman Second Class James Doc was organizing his medical supplies, preparing for any scenario that might require his skills. The team leader, Chief Petty Officer Steele Anderson, was discussing final details with the pilot. Sarah had served under Anderson for 2 years, and she trusted him completely. He was the kind of leader who never asked his team to do anything he wouldn't do himself, and his tactical brilliance had gotten them out of more tight spots than she could count. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah felt the familiar mix of adrenaline and calm focus that came before every mission. She went through her mental checklist, visualizing every aspect of the operation. The flight would take 45 minutes over mountainous terrain. They would insert at a landing zone 2 kilometers from the village, approach on foot, secure the asset, and return to the extraction point. Simple, clean, efficient. The landscape below was a harsh tapestry of brown rocks and sparse vegetation. Afghanistan had a brutal beauty that Sarah had learned to appreciate during her deployments. The mountains were ancient and unforgiving, having witnessed countless armies march across their peaks and valleys throughout history. Today, they would witness one more small operation in an endless war. 20 minutes into the flight, Ghost's voice crackled through the team's headsets. "Phoenix, we're getting some chatter on enemy frequencies. Looks like they know we're coming." Sarah keyed her microphone. "What's the nature of the chatter?" "Multiple units moving toward the target area. They're coordinating something big." Chief Anderson made the decision quickly. "We continue with the mission. Our asset is counting on us, and we don't leave people behind." Sarah nodded, though she felt a slight tightness in her stomach. Intelligence was always imperfect, and battlefield conditions changed rapidly. But they had trained for this, and they were prepared for contact with enemy forces. Her hand unconsciously moved to check her sidearm, a habit she had developed during her first deployment. The pilot's voice came through the intercom. 5 minutes to insertion point." Sarah looked out the window at the approaching terrain. The landing zone was a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings that could provide cover for their approach. Everything looked exactly as it had in the satellite images they had studied. But something felt different about this mission, though she couldn't quite identify what. As they began their descent toward the landing zone, Ghost suddenly sat up straight, pressing his hand against his headset. "Chief, I'm picking up multiple signatures on radar. We've got company coming in fast." Before anyone could respond, the world exploded around them. The rocket-propelled grenade struck the helicopter's tail rotor with devastating precision. The aircraft immediately began spinning violently, the pilot fighting desperately to maintain control. Sarah was thrown against the side of the cabin, her helmet cracking against the metal wall. The sound was indescribable, a combination of tearing metal, screaming engines, and the rush of wind through the damaged aircraft. "We're going down," the pilot shouted over the chaos. "Prepare for hard landing." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She braced herself against the spinning motion, protecting her head and checking that her teammates were doing the same. Through the chaos, she could see Chief Anderson trying to reach the radio to call for help, while Doc was already preparing his medical kit for what was coming next. The helicopter hit the mountainside with tremendous force, bouncing once before slamming into a rocky outcropping. Sarah felt her restraints cut into her body as the aircraft rolled over twice before coming to rest on its side. The sudden silence that followed the crash was more terrifying than the noise had been. Sarah hung upside down in her harness, blood from a head wound dripping onto the ceiling below her. Her ears were ringing, and everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. She could taste copper in her mouth and smell the acrid scent of burning fuel and electrical equipment. But she was alive, and her mind was already beginning to process the situation. "Sound off," Chief Anderson's voice was strained but strong. "Everyone report status." "Phoenix conscious and mobile," Sarah managed to say, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. "Tank, I'm good, but my left arm's messed up." "Ghost, I'm okay, but the radio equipment is destroyed." "Rico, I've got some cuts, but I'm functional." "Doc here, I'm hurt, but I can still do my job." Sarah worked to free herself from her restraints, her hands shaking slightly from adrenaline. As she dropped to what had been the ceiling of the aircraft, she could see daylight streaming through a large hole in the fuselage. The helicopter was completely destroyed, twisted metal and broken equipment scattered everywhere. Chief Anderson was already moving, helping other team members get free from their restraints. His left leg was clearly injured, but he was functioning on pure willpower and leadership instinct. "We need to get out of this bird before someone comes to investigate the crash site. Grab essential gear only, we're moving on foot." Sarah checked her primary weapon, relieved to find it intact. Her body armor had protected her from the worst of the impact, though she could feel bruises forming where the restraints had held her during the crash. She grabbed her rucksack and helped Ghost extract the portable radio equipment that might still be functional. As they prepared to leave the wreckage, Sarah could hear something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, growing closer, was the sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles moving fast across the rough terrain. Their crash site had been observed, and enemy forces were coming to investigate. "Chief, we've got visitors coming," she reported, moving to a position where she could observe the approach routes to their location. How many Sarah led her team through the rocky terrain, every step calculated to minimize their trail while maximizing their speed. Behind them, she could hear the sound of the enemy vehicles reaching their crash site, followed by shouting voices and the metallic sounds of weapons being prepared. The hunt had officially begun. Chief Anderson was struggling more than he wanted to admit. His left leg had taken significant damage in the crash, and every step sent waves of pain through his body. But he pushed forward, knowing that showing weakness would demoralize the team when they needed confidence most. Sarah could see his struggle in the tight set of his jaw and the way he favored his right leg. "Chief, let me take a look at that leg," Doc said during one of their brief stops to check their back trail. "No time, Doc. We need distance between us and them before we worry about medical treatment." Doc persisted. "Sir, if that leg gives out completely, we'll be in worse shape than if we take 2 minutes to stabilize it now." Sarah kept watch while Doc quickly examined Anderson's injury. The leg wasn't broken, but the knee was severely damaged and swelling rapidly. Doc pulled out an elastic bandage and quickly wrapped the joint, providing support that would allow Anderson to continue moving. Tank Johnson was dealing with his own injury, a dislocated shoulder that he had reset himself during their climb. The man was built like his nickname suggested, broad and solid, with arms like tree trunks. But even his considerable strength couldn't completely compensate for the damaged joint. Rico had taken most of Tank's heavy equipment, redistributing the load among the team members who were less injured. Ghost was perhaps the most devastated by their situation, not because of physical injuries, but because all of his communication equipment had been destroyed in the crash. As their communications specialist, he felt personally responsible for their inability to call for help. Sarah had seen this before, the way technical specialists blamed themselves when their equipment failed, even when the failure was completely beyond their control. "Ghost, none of this is your fault," Sarah said as they climbed higher into the mountains. "Focus on what we can control now." "I know, Phoenix, it's just, if I could get even one radio working, we could call for extraction. We could end this. And if we had wings, we could fly home. We work with what we have, not what we wish we had." They had been climbing for 2 hours when they heard the first helicopter. Sarah immediately called for the team to take cover among a cluster of large boulders. The aircraft passed overhead, flying a search pattern that covered the valleys below their position. It was an old Soviet-era helicopter, probably captured from Afghan forces, but it was equipped with modern thermal imaging equipment. "They're being systematic about this," Chief Anderson observed. "This isn't just a patrol that happened to see us crash. They've got resources dedicated to hunting us down." Sarah nodded grimly. "Which means our intelligence asset was more important than we were told, or there's something else going on here." As the helicopter moved away to search another area, the team continued their climb. Sarah was navigating by compass and memory, having studied topographical maps of this region during mission planning. Their immediate goal was to reach high ground where they could establish a defensive position and assess their options. Their long-term goal was to reach friendly territory, but that was over 100 kilometers away through enemy-controlled mountains. The afternoon sun was beginning to set when they finally reached what Sarah considered a defensible position. It was a natural shelf in the mountainside, protected by rock formations on 3 sides with a clear view of the approaches from below. More importantly, there were several caves behind the shelf that could provide shelter and concealment. "We'll set up here for the night," Chief Anderson decided. "Doc, see to everyone's injuries. Rico, set up security positions. Tank, help Ghost see if he can get any of that radio equipment working. Phoenix, scout the immediate area and identify escape routes." Sarah spent the next hour exploring their temporary base, identifying 3 different routes they could use if they were discovered. The caves extended deep into the mountain, creating a natural tunnel system that could be useful if they needed to disappear quickly. She also found a small spring that would provide fresh water, a critical resource for their survival. When she returned, Doc had finished treating everyone's injuries as best he could with limited supplies. Chief Anderson's leg was stabilized but would need rest to heal properly. Tank's shoulder was functional but would limit his effectiveness in combat. Everyone had various cuts and bruises from the crash, but nothing that would prevent them from moving if necessary. "What's our situation assessment?" Anderson asked as the team gathered in the largest cave. Ghost spoke first. "Communications are a total loss. The portable radio took too much damage in the crash, and I don't have the parts to repair it. We're on our own until we can reach friendly forces or they send search and rescue." Rico had been monitoring enemy radio traffic with a small scanner that had survived the crash. "They're coordinating search teams across this entire mountain range. I count at least 8 different units involved in the hunt, including helicopters and ground teams. They've set up checkpoints on all the main roads leading out of the area." "What about our original mission?" Tank asked. "Our asset is still out there." Chief Anderson was quiet for a moment. "Our asset is probably dead or captured by now. Our mission priority has shifted to survival and escape. We get out alive, we debrief, and we let command decide how to handle the intelligence failure." Sarah understood the logic, but it went against everything they had been trained to believe. SEALs didn't abandon missions, and they didn't leave people behind. But Anderson was right. Their first responsibility was to their own team's survival. As darkness fell, they established a watch rotation and tried to rest. Sarah took the first watch, positioning herself where she could observe the approaches to their position. The night was clear and cold, with enough starlight to see movement in the valleys below. For the first few hours, everything was quiet. Then she saw the lights. Multiple vehicles were moving through the valley, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searching fingers. They were moving slowly, methodically, checking every possible hiding place. Sarah counted at least 6 vehicles in this group alone, and she could see other lights in adjacent valleys. During the night, 2 more helicopters passed overhead, using searchlights to examine suspicious areas. The enemy was conducting a thorough, professional search operation. Someone with military training was coordinating this hunt, not the typical loosely organized militia they usually encountered. When morning came, Chief Anderson called a planning session. They had survived their first night, but their situation was becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. The enemy was tightening their search perimeter, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. "We have 2 options," Anderson explained. We can try to hide here and wait for rescue, or we can start moving toward friendly territory. Both options have serious risks. Sarah had been thinking about this all night. If we stay here, we're depending on search and rescue finding us before the enemy does. But SAR doesn't even know where to look because we never made it to our original destination. And if we move, we're exposing ourselves to enemy patrols and checkpoints, Rico pointed out. Not necessarily, Sarah said, pulling out the map she had been studying. Look at the terrain here. If we move at night and stick to the high ground, we can avoid most of their search pattern. They're concentrating on the valleys and main routes. Ghost was skeptical. That's over 100 kilometers of mountain terrain. In our condition, that's at least a week of travel, assuming we don't run into any problems. Problems are guaranteed, Tank said. The third night of their journey brought Sarah's team face to face with their first real test of combat effectiveness. They had been making good progress, covering nearly 20 kilometers each night while avoiding enemy patrols during their daylight rest periods. But their luck was about to run out in the most dangerous way possible. Sarah was leading the team along a ridge line when she spotted the enemy checkpoint below. It hadn't been there during her map study, which meant it was a temporary position established specifically for their search operation. The checkpoint controlled the only practical route through a narrow valley that would save them 2 days of difficult climbing over exposed terrain. "Hold position," she whispered into her throat microphone, and the team immediately froze among the rocks scattered along the ridge. Sarah studied the checkpoint through her night vision scope. 8 fighters with automatic weapons, 2 vehicles, and what appeared to be a heavy machine gun mounted on one of the trucks. They had established their position with professional precision, covering all approaches to the valley with overlapping fields of fire. Someone with real military training was definitely organizing this search operation. Chief Anderson crawled up beside her to assess the situation. His injured leg was holding up better than expected, though Sarah could see the constant pain in the tight lines around his eyes. Doc had been monitoring the injury during their rest periods, and the swelling was gradually decreasing with rest and elevation. "What do you think?" Anderson whispered. "It's a solid position. Attacking frontally would be suicide with our numbers and condition, but look at their security pattern." Sarah had been observing the checkpoint for 30 minutes, timing the guards' movements and identifying weaknesses. They're focused on watching the approaches from below. Their rear security is weak, and they're not expecting anyone to come from above. "You're thinking about going around them." "I'm thinking about going through them, quietly. If we can eliminate the sentries without raising an alarm, we can pass through their position and continue our route. If we go around, we add at least 2 days to our journey through terrain that offers no concealment from their helicopters." Anderson considered this. Their food and water situation was becoming critical, and 2 extra days of travel could push them beyond their physical limits. But a direct assault on an enemy position with an injured team was incredibly risky. "What's your plan?" Sarah had been working on this since she first spotted the checkpoint. "Tank and I go down first, take out the rear sentries silently. Ghost provides overwatch with the long rifle. Rico and Doc stay with you in reserve. If anything goes wrong, you pull back and find another route. And if everything goes right, we signal all clear. You bring the team through, and we're 20 kilometers closer to home by sunrise." Anderson made his decision quickly. In the SEALs, leaders were expected to make hard choices with incomplete information, and second-guessing led to paralysis. "Do it, But if the situation goes bad, you break contact immediately. Don't try to be heroes. Sarah checked her gear one final time. Her knife was razor sharp, and her suppressed pistol was loaded with subsonic ammunition. Tank Johnson, despite his injured shoulder, was still the most physically capable member of their team. His size and strength made him invaluable for close-quarters combat, and his pain tolerance was legendary among their unit. "You ready for this, Tank?" "Been ready since we hit the ground, Phoenix. Let's go remind these guys why they should be afraid of the dark." The descent to the checkpoint took 40 minutes of careful movement through rocky terrain. Sarah led the way, using every skill she had learned in stalking and infiltration training. Each step was planned to avoid loose rocks, each pause calculated to match the patterns of the wind that would mask any sound they might make. Tank followed 10 meters behind, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. Sarah had seen him move like this before, and it never failed to amaze her how someone built like a linebacker could become nearly invisible when the situation required it. They reached the perimeter of the checkpoint without being detected. Sarah could see the two rear sentries clearly now, positioned about 50 meters apart on either side of the vehicles. They were alert but not expecting trouble, their attention focused primarily on the radio chatter from other search units rather than their immediate surroundings. Sarah hand-signaled her plan to Tank. She would take the sentry on the left, he would take the one on the right. They would move simultaneously to prevent either guard from raising an alarm. It had to be perfect because there would be no second chance. Sarah approached her target from behind, using a broken wall as concealment until she was within striking distance. The sentry was young, probably no more than 20, with his rifle slung casually across his shoulder while he listened to a handheld radio. He never saw her coming. The knife strike was precise and fatal, severing the carotid artery and windpipe simultaneously. The sentry collapsed without making a sound, and Sarah immediately dragged his body behind the wall where it wouldn't be visible to his companions. Tank's approach was different but equally effective. His massive hands simply crushed his target's windpipe while simultaneously covering his mouth. The sentry struggled briefly but was unconscious within seconds, dead within a minute. Tank also concealed the body, then signaled to Sarah that his objective was complete. Now came the most dangerous part. They had eliminated the outer security, but 6 fighters remained in the checkpoint's main position. Sarah studied their positions, looking for the best approach to neutralize the remaining threats. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the fighters left the main group to check on the rear sentries, following a routine that Sarah realized they had been observing for the past hour. When he discovered the missing guards, he would raise an alarm that would bring the entire enemy search operation down on their position. Sarah made a split-second decision. Instead of waiting for the discovery, she would intercept the fighter and use his radio to create a diversion. It was risky, but it offered the best chance of getting her team through the checkpoint without a prolonged firefight. She positioned herself along the fighter's route and waited. When he passed her hiding position, she struck quickly, disabling him with a chokehold that rendered him unconscious but alive. She took his radio and quickly studied its functions, grateful for the language training that allowed her to understand the basic commands. Speaking in accented but understandable Pashto, she keyed the radio and reported a possible sighting of the American team in a valley 2 kilometers east of their actual position. The response was immediate, with multiple units redirecting to investigate the false report. More importantly, 3 of the remaining 5 fighters at the checkpoint received orders to move to support positions along the reported escape route. Within minutes, the checkpoint was down to 2 fighters, and they were distracted by the radio traffic about the supposed sighting. Sarah signaled Tank to move into position for the final phase of their assault. The remaining 2 fighters never had a chance. Sarah and Tank approached from different angles, using the noise of their own radio chatter to mask their movement. Both enemies were neutralized within seconds of each other, and the checkpoint was clear. Sarah immediately signaled the all-clear to Chief Anderson, and the rest of the team began their descent to the captured position. But she also knew they had only minutes before someone noticed that the checkpoint wasn't responding to radio calls. "We need to move fast," she told Anderson when he reached her post on the 5th day of their escape. Sarah's team encountered something that would shake their understanding of who they could trust in this hostile territory. They had been making steady progress through the mountains, staying ahead of enemy search teams through careful navigation and tactical movement. But what happened next would test not only their survival skills, but their ability to distinguish between friend and enemy in a war where nothing was as simple as it seemed. The village appeared in the early morning light as they crested a ridge, a small cluster of mud brick buildings nestled in a valley that offered the most direct route toward friendly territory. Sarah studied it through her binoculars, looking for signs of enemy presence or civilian activity that might indicate whether the settlement was safe to approach. "What do you see?" Chief Anderson asked, crawling up beside her observation position. "Maybe 30 buildings, some livestock, people moving around doing normal village activities. No obvious military presence, no vehicles that don't belong." Sarah continued scanning the area, but something feels wrong about it. She couldn't identify exactly what was bothering her about the scene below. The village looked peaceful, almost too peaceful for an area where enemy forces had been conducting intensive search operations for the past 5 days. There were no signs of the tension and fear that usually accompanied military operations in civilian areas. Rico had been monitoring enemy radio traffic throughout their rest period, and his intelligence provided another piece of the puzzle. "The chatter has changed in the last 12 hours. They're not talking about search grids anymore. Now they're coordinating with local village leaders, asking for cooperation in locating the American team." "Cooperation or coercion?" Anderson asked. "Hard to tell from the radio traffic, but it sounds like they're offering rewards for information. Significant rewards, enough to change the economic situation for an entire village." Sarah understood the implications immediately. In this part of Afghanistan, villages survived through a careful balance of cooperation and resistance with various armed groups. Loyalty could be bought, and desperation made people willing to betray strangers for the promise of security or prosperity. Tank Johnson was studying the village through his own optics. "I count 3 possible ways through that valley without going directly through the village. But they all add at least a day to our timeline, and we're already cutting things close with our food and water situation." Doc had been monitoring the team's medical status throughout their journey, and his assessment was becoming increasingly concerning. "Chief Anderson's leg is holding up better than expected, but everyone's losing weight and strength. We're operating on adrenaline and willpower, but that's not sustainable indefinitely." Ghost had made progress with the captured radio equipment, managing to access enemy frequencies and gain insight into their operational patterns. "They're coordinating with at least 12 villages in this area. Someone's building a comprehensive intelligence network, using local civilians as observers and informants. As Sarah continued studying the village, she noticed something that made her decision easier. A small group of children was playing near the outskirts of the settlement, their games taking them close to the route the team would need to use to bypass the village entirely. If they tried to avoid the settlement, they would likely be spotted by those children, and children had a tendency to be curious about unusual strangers. "We're going through the village," she decided, "but we're going to do it smart." Chief Anderson looked at her questioningly. "Think about it. 6 armed Americans trying to sneak around the village are going to attract attention and suspicion. But what if we don't try to hide what we are?" Sarah pulled out the map and showed her plan to the team. "We walk directly into the village in full view, acting like we're supposed to be there. We're American advisors conducting liaison with local leaders. We're confident, professional, and we have legitimate business in the area." Tank was skeptical. "That's a hell of a risk, Phoenix. If even one person in that village is working with the enemy, we're walking into a trap. And if we try to sneak around and get spotted anyway, we look like exactly what we are, escaped Americans trying to avoid capture. At least this way, we control the narrative." Rico had been thinking through the operational security implications. "It could work, but we'd need to establish a plausible cover story. Why are American advisors traveling through this area? What's our mission? Where are our vehicles?" Sarah had been working on these details since she first proposed the plan. "We're advance reconnaissance for a humanitarian aid delivery. Our helicopter had mechanical problems and had to return to base, so we're continuing on foot to assess village needs and security situation. It explains why we're here, why we're on foot, and why we're moving toward friendly territory." Doc understood the medical implications of the plan. "If they accept our cover story, we might be able to get food, water, and medical supplies. If they don't, we're trapped in a confined area with limited escape routes." Chief Anderson weighed the risks and benefits quickly. They were trained to make decisions with incomplete information, and overthinking could be as dangerous as acting rashly. "We do it, but we go in ready for immediate action if things go wrong. Phoenix, you take the lead on communication since you have the best language skills." The team spent an hour preparing for their deception. They adjusted their gear to look more like an official military patrol and less like an escape and evasion unit. Ghost organized their captured maps and intelligence materials to support their cover story. Rico prepared a plausible explanation for their lack of vehicles and communication equipment. Sarah reviewed her language skills, practicing the phrases she would need to establish their cover story and maintain their deception. She also mentally rehearsed the signals she would use to communicate danger to her team if the situation deteriorated. As they approached the village in broad daylight, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of confidence and alertness that came with executing a high-risk operation. Everything depended on their ability to sell the deception convincingly while remaining ready for immediate combat if necessary. The first villager they encountered was an elderly man tending goats near the settlement's entrance. Sarah approached him with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in the area, greeting him in Pashto and explaining that they were American advisors conducting preliminary assessment for aid distribution. The man's reaction was cautiously positive. He welcomed them to the village and offered to take them to the village elder, a response that suggested their cover story was plausible. But Sarah noticed something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation that made her wonder if he was already thinking about potential rewards for reporting their presence. The village elder was a shrewd man in his 60s who listened carefully to Sarah's explanation of their mission. He asked intelligent questions about the proposed aid delivery, demonstrating a thorough understanding of how such operations typically functioned. His questions were so detailed that Sarah began to suspect he had significant experience dealing with both American forces and insurgent groups. "You are welcome in our village," the elder said finally. "We can provide food and rest for your team, but I must ask, why are you traveling on foot through such dangerous territory? This area has seen much military activity in recent days." Sarah had anticipated this question. "Our helicopter developed mechanical problems and had to return to base for repairs. Since time is critical for assessing security conditions, we decided to continue on foot rather than wait for another aircraft." The elder nodded, but Sarah caught a subtle exchange of glances between him and another village leader. It was the kind of wordless communication that suggested prior discussion about exactly this situation. Tank had positioned himself where he could observe the village's perimeter while appearing to rest casually. His subtle hand signals indicated that more people were gathering around the edges of the settlement, not threatening, but definitely watching their every movement. Ghost was monitoring radio frequencies, and his expression grew increasingly tense as he listened to enemy communications. Finally, he approached Sarah with information that changed everything. "Phoenix, I'm picking up chatter about American advisors in this area. Someone's already reported our presence." Sarah felt ice in her stomach, but maintained her casual demeanor. They were committed to their cover story now, and breaking character would confirm any suspicions about their true identity. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 30 minutes before enemy forces arrive to investigate. But here's the interesting part. They're not treating this as a confirmed sighting. They're responding to a report about possible American military presence, not escaped prisoners." Sarah realized they were at a critical decision point. They could try to maintain their deception and hope to bluff their way through an encounter with enemy forces, or they could abandon the village immediately and return to evasion tactics. Both options carried enormous risks. The decision was made for them when the village elder approached, with an offer that revealed the true complexity of their situation. "I have spoken with my council," he said carefully. "We are willing to help American advisors complete their mission, but we must also consider our own security. There are many armed groups in this area who would view cooperation with Americans as a hostile act." Sarah understood immediately. The village was playing all sides, willing to help them as long as it didn't compromise the villagers' own survival. They weren't necessarily enemies, but they weren't allies either. They were civilians trying to survive in a war zone where wrong decisions could result in massacre. "What do you propose?" she asked. "You rest here today as our guests. Tonight, when it is dark, we will provide guides to help you reach the next valley safely. But if military forces arrive to investigate, we know nothing about American advisors. You are travelers who stopped for food and water, nothing more." It was a reasonable compromise that acknowledged the realities of their situation. The villagers weren't willing to risk their lives fighting enemy forces, but they were willing to help the team escape without betraying them directly. Chief Anderson made the decision quickly. "Agreed. We appreciate your hospitality and your discretion." As the team settled in to wait for nightfall, Sarah reflected on the seventh day dawned with Sarah's team positioned just 15 kilometers from friendly territory. closer to safety than they had been since their helicopter was shot down. But as they prepared for what should have been their final push toward freedom, they discovered that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The enemy had been herding them toward this exact position, and now they found themselves facing a carefully orchestrated trap that would test every skill they had learned and every bond they had forged as a team. Sarah was studying the terrain ahead through her binoculars when she first realized something was fundamentally wrong with their situation. The valley they needed to cross to reach friendly territory was too quiet, too empty for an area that should have normal civilian and military traffic. More concerning was the fact that their intended route was almost suspiciously perfect, offering excellent concealment and multiple approach options toward the American outpost they were trying to reach. "Chief, this doesn't feel right," she reported to Anderson, who was checking his injured leg one final time before their movement. "Talk to me, Phoenix. What are you seeing?" "I'm seeing what I want to see, and that's what worries me. The route is too good, the timing is too perfect. It's like someone laid out a pathway specifically for us to follow." Chief Anderson crawled up to join her observation, bringing his own optics to study the valley below. After 10 minutes of careful examination, his expression confirmed Sarah's suspicions. "You're right, this is a kill zone. Look at those on either side of the valley. Perfect positions for ambush teams, and I'm betting they're occupied." Ghost had been monitoring enemy radio traffic throughout their final approach, and his intelligence painted an even grimmer picture of their situation. "The chatter has been decreasing for the past 12 hours, which usually means they're moving into final positions for a coordinated operation. But here's what's really interesting. I'm picking up American radio signatures from multiple positions around that valley." Tank Johnson looked up from checking his weapon for the third time that morning. "American signatures? Could be our people running a patrol." "Wrong frequency patterns," Ghost replied. "These are our radios, but they're being operated by people who learned the procedures without growing up with the technology. The timing is just slightly off. The protocol usage is textbook perfect instead of naturally casual." Sarah felt the pieces clicking into place. "They've been herding us toward this position for days. Every time we've had to change routes because of enemy activity, every time we've found a clear path forward, it's been guiding us toward this valley." Rico had been analyzing the tactical situation from an intelligence perspective, and his assessment was equally disturbing. "If they've been manipulating our route for this long, they know exactly how we operate. They've been studying our decision-making patterns, our tactical preferences, our physical limitations." Doc had been monitoring the team's medical condition throughout their escape, and he provided the final piece of their strategic assessment. "We're at about 60% physical capacity. Good enough to fight, but not good enough to fight at our peak performance level. If someone's been tracking our condition as well as our movement, they've timed this ambush for maximum effectiveness." Chief Anderson processed all this information quickly, weighing their options against the reality of their situation. They were 15 kilometers from safety, but those 15 kilometers might as well have been 1,500 if they were walking into a carefully prepared killing field. "Options?" he asked his team. Sarah had been thinking about this since she first suspected they were being manipulated. "We can try to go around the valley, but that adds at least 2 days to our journey through terrain we haven't reconnoitered. We can try to push through the ambush using speed and aggression, or we can try to turn this trap around on them." "Explain the third option." "They're expecting us to either avoid the obvious trap or walk straight into it. They're not expecting us to identify the trap and use it against them. If we can determine their exact positions and timing, we might be able to eliminate their ambush teams and turn their own kill zone into our escape route. Tank was immediately interested in this approach. It's risky as hell, but it plays to our strengths. These guys might have learned our procedures, but they haven't lived them. In close combat, training beats study every time. Ghost had been continuing his analysis of the radio traffic, and he provided crucial intelligence for their planning. I've identified at least 4 separate teams positioned around the valley, 2 on the North Ridge, 2 on the South Ridge, and probably a blocking force positioned near what they think is our objective. How many fighters total? Estimate 20 to 30 based on radio patterns. But here's the key detail. They're using our captured equipment to coordinate, which means they're dependent on technology they don't fully understand. If we can disrupt their communications, we can probably break up their coordination. Sarah began developing a plan that would use their expertise against the enemy's numerical advantage. What if we don't go into the valley at all? What if we go up and over eliminate one of their ambush teams, and use their position to attack the others? Rico was studying the topographical map, identifying specific routes and positions. The North Ridge has better cover for approach, and if Ghost is right about their positions, we could take out one team and use their weapons and radio equipment against the others. Doc understood the medical implications of their plan. It's going to require maximum physical effort from everyone, including Chief Anderson on that injured leg. But if it works, we could be in friendly territory by tonight instead of fighting through enemy patrols for another week. Chief Anderson made his decision with the confidence that had kept his team alive through countless operations. We do it. Phoenix, you lead the assault team up the North Ridge. Tank and Rico with you. Ghost, Doc, and I will provide support and prepare to exploit whatever advantage you create. Sarah felt the familiar calm focus that preceded combat operations. This was what they had trained for, what their entire military careers had been building toward. Not just the physical skills of warfare, but the mental toughness to make desperate plans work through determination and teamwork. The approach to the North Ridge took 3 hours of careful movement through terrain that offered minimal concealment. Sarah led Tank and Rico up slopes that tested their physical conditioning and tactical patience. Every step had to be planned to avoid detection by enemy observers who might be watching for exactly this type of movement. When they reached a position where Sarah could observe the enemy ambush site, she discovered that Ghost's intelligence had been remarkably accurate. 2 teams of 4 fighters each were positioned in prepared positions with excellent fields of fire into the valley below. They were well equipped and disciplined, confirming her suspicion that this operation was being run by someone with professional military experience. But they had made one crucial mistake. They were so focused on watching the valley for approaching Americans that their rear security was minimal. Sarah identified an approach route that would allow her team to get within striking distance without being detected. The assault began at exactly noon, when the enemy teams would be most affected by sun glare and heat fatigue. Sarah approached the first position from behind while Tank and Rico moved to eliminate the second team simultaneously. It had to be coordinated perfectly, because any alarm would bring the entire ambush force down on their position. Sarah's target never saw her coming. She had learned stalking techniques that allowed her to become nearly invisible in rough terrain, and her knife work was precise and silent. The first fighter was neutralized before he realized he was in danger. Tank's approach was more direct but equally effective. His enormous physical strength allowed him to disable multiple opponents quickly, while Rico provided precise rifle fire to eliminate any fighter who might escape or raise an alarm. Within 90 seconds, both enemy teams were neutralized, and Sarah's team had captured their weapons, radios, and tactical intelligence. More importantly, they now controlled high ground positions that commanded the entire valley. Ghost's voice crackled through their captured radio equipment. "Phoenix, you've got enemy teams moving toward your position from the South Ridge. They know something's wrong." Sarah quickly assessed their new tactical situation. They had eliminated 4 enemy fighters and gained control of strategic positions, but they were now exposed to counterattack from the remaining ambush teams. This was the critical moment when their plan would either succeed completely or fail catastrophically. Tank Rico set up defensive positions covering our back trail. I'm going to use their radio to create some confusion among the remaining teams. Using the captured radio equipment and her language skills, Sarah began transmitting false reports that suggested the American team had been spotted moving toward a different area entirely. The response was immediate, with enemy teams repositioning to intercept a threat that didn't exist. But the most crucial moment came when Chief Anderson's voice came through on their team frequency, reporting that friendly forces had detected their position and were moving to provide support. After 7 days of isolation and desperation, they were no longer alone. "Phoenix, we've got American helicopters inbound from the east. ETA 15 minutes. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and determination. They had survived 7 days behind enemy lines, proven their ability to fight and adapt under impossible conditions, and maintained their effectiveness as a team despite injuries and exhaustion. But they still had to survive the next 15 minutes. The final firefight was brief, but intense. The remaining enemy forces, realizing their ambush had been turned against them, attempted a desperate assault on Sarah's position. But they were attacking uphill against entrenched defenders who had superior training and motivation. When the American helicopters arrived, they found Sarah's team in control of the battlefield, having eliminated an entire enemy operation while capturing significant intelligence about insurgent tactics and organization. As Sarah climbed aboard the rescue helicopter, she looked back at the valley where they had been supposed to die. Instead, they had turned their enemy's careful plan into their own victory. It was a fitting end to a week that had tested everything they claimed to be as SEALs. During the flight back to base, Chief Anderson looked at his team and realized they had accomplished something beyond simple survival. They had proven that even in the most hopeless situations, properly trained and motivated warriors could find ways to not just endure, but prevail. Sarah Martinez had led her team through 7 days of hell and brought them all home alive. More than that, she had demonstrated the qualities that made the SEALs legendary: adaptability, determination, and the absolute refusal to quit no matter what the odds. As the helicopter carried them towards safety, Sarah was already thinking about the intelligence they had gathered and the lessons they had learned. This mission had ended, but the war continued, and the knowledge they had gained would help save other American lives in future operations. But for now, it was enough that they were going home. 6 SEALs had been shot down behind enemy lines, and 6 SEALs were returning to fight another day. In the end, that was what mattered most. A complex moral landscape they were navigating. In this war, there were no clear boundaries between friend and enemy, ally, and threat. Survival often depended on understanding that most people were simply trying to protect their families and communities in an impossible situation. But as Ghost continued monitoring radio traffic, it became clear that their situation was about to become even more complicated. Enemy forces weren't just investigating reports of American advisors. They were converging on this area with significant resources. Someone had provided very specific intelligence about their location and movement patterns. Sarah began to suspect that their escape wasn't just being tracked by enemy forces. It was being manipulated by someone with detailed knowledge of their capabilities and likely decisions. The question was whether they were walking into a trap or if they could turn the situation to their advantage. As afternoon turned to evening, the team prepared for what might be their most challenging night yet. They had learned that survival behind enemy lines wasn't just about avoiding capture. It was about navigating the complex relationships and shifting loyalties that defined life in a war zone. But they had also proven something important about themselves. Even in the most uncertain situations, they could adapt and find ways to accomplish their mission. Tonight would test whether that adaptability was enough to get them home alive. The team moved through the checkpoint quickly, gathering useful intelligence and supplies before continuing their journey. Rico collected enemy maps that showed other checkpoints and patrol routes, information that would be invaluable for their continued escape. Doc found medical supplies that would help extend their capabilities for treating injuries. Most importantly, Ghost discovered a radio that was still functional, though he would need time to figure out its encryption and frequency settings. The possibility of establishing communication with friendly forces was the first real hope they had felt since the crash. As they moved away from the captured checkpoint, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. They had successfully overcome their first major obstacle, proving that they could still function as an effective combat unit despite their injuries and isolation. But they had also escalated their situation from simple evasion to active combat with enemy forces. How long before they figure out what happened here? Anderson asked as they put distance between themselves and the checkpoint. 20 minutes, maybe 30, Sarah replied. After that, they'll know for certain that we're alive and moving in this direction. The team pushed hard through the remainder of the night, covering an additional 15 kilometers before finding a suitable place to rest during daylight hours. They had reached the edge of the immediate search area, but Sarah knew the enemy would expand their perimeter once they discovered the checkpoint had been overrun. As dawn broke over the mountains, Sarah found herself on watch duty again, studying the terrain ahead and behind them. In the distance, she could see helicopters beginning their morning search patterns, and she noticed they were flying further east than on previous days. The hunt was intensifying, but they had proven something important during the night's action. They weren't just survivors trying to avoid capture. They were still SEALs, still capable of taking the fight to the enemy when necessary. That knowledge would be crucial for what lay ahead, because Sarah suspected the hardest part of their journey was just beginning. The enemy now knew exactly what they were dealing with and would respond accordingly. The next few days would determine whether 6 injured American warriors could outfight and outthink an entire enemy organization on their home territory. Sarah checked her weapon and began planning for the challenges ahead. They had made it through 3 days, but they still had a long way to go before they could call themselves safe. In the distance, the radio chatter was increasing as enemy units coordinated their response to the checkpoint attack. The game of cat and mouse was about to become much more serious, and Sarah intended to make sure her team remained the hunters rather than the hunted. N is whether we face them sitting still or moving towards safety. Doc had remained quiet during the discussion, but now he spoke up. Medically speaking, Chief Anderson needs rest for that leg to heal properly, but staying in one place for a week is a luxury we probably don't have. If we're going to move, we should start soon before his condition gets worse. Chief Anderson listened to everyone's input before making his decision. We move tonight. Sarah, you'll navigate. We'll travel during darkness and lay up during daylight hours. Our goal is to cover 15 to 20 kilometers per night. Sarah spent the rest of the day studying the map and planning their route. She identified potential hiding places for each day's rest period, water sources along the way, and alternate routes in case they encountered enemy forces. It was a complex puzzle, made more challenging by their physical limitations and the certainty that the enemy was actively hunting them. As the sun began to set on their second day behind enemy lines, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and dread. They were finally taking action, moving towards safety instead of waiting passively for rescue or discovery. But they were also leaving the security of their defensive position for the unknown dangers of traveling through enemy territory. The team prepared to move with practiced efficiency. They divided their remaining supplies to distribute weight among those who could carry it. Ghost reluctantly left behind his damaged radio equipment, keeping only the scanner for monitoring enemy communications. Doc organized his medical supplies to treat injuries while on the move. "Remember," Chief Anderson said as they prepared to leave their cave, "we're not just trying to survive. We're trying to make it home with intelligence about enemy capabilities and organization. Every detail we observe could be valuable to future operations." Sarah took point as they began their descent from the mountain shelf, leading the team into the darkness below. Behind them, their temporary refuge disappeared into the night. Ahead lay 7 days of the most challenging survival test any of them had ever faced. But as Sarah navigated through the rocky terrain, she felt something she hadn't expected. Despite their desperate situation, despite being injured and cut off from support, she felt alive in a way that was almost exhilarating. This was what all their training had prepared them for. This was the ultimate test of everything they claimed to be. The hunt was far from over, but now they were no longer just prey. They were SEALs behind enemy lines, and they were going to fight their way home. Sarah pulled out her binoculars and scanned the area below their crash site. What she saw made her stomach drop. 3 pickup trucks loaded with armed fighters were making their way up the mountain road. Behind them, she could see dust clouds indicating more vehicles following. This wasn't a small patrol, this was a significant force. "At least 30 fighters in the first wave, with more coming behind," she reported. Chief Anderson made another quick decision. "We can't fight that many in the open. We need to move to high ground and find a defensive position. Phoenix, you take point. We're going up the mountain." As Sarah led her injured team away from the wreckage, she could hear the vehicles getting closer. They had maybe 10 minutes before the enemy reached the crash site, and then the real fight would begin. But she had been trained for this exact scenario. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. SEAL training had prepared her for the possibility of being trapped behind enemy lines. What it hadn't prepared her for was how personal this would become, how every decision over the next 7 days would determine whether she and her teammates would ever see home again. The mission had changed from extraction to survival, and Sarah Martinez was about to discover what she was truly made of. The mountain stretched above them, harsh and unforgiving, but it was their only hope of escape. As they climbed away from the wreckage, leaving behind their destroyed helicopter and any hope of quick rescue, Sarah felt something harden inside her. They were on their own now, 6 injured SEALs against an entire enemy force in their own territory. But they were SEALs, and SEALs don't quit. No matter what came next, they would find a way home.